So when you talk about AI, it's very tempting to just lump AI into one big category, but that's not quite how it works. There are right now two distinct types of AI. There is vertical AI, which is the kind of AI that might, for example, sort driving data, or drive your Tesla, or even help make a reservation for you, or suggest a restaurant for you to go to when you ask your phone, where should I eat dinner? Then there's general AI. And general AI would be if one of the panelists right now was actually an artificial intelligence. And the general AI is something that is not quite as far along right now as vertical AI. General AI is where you get the super intelligences that a lot of the futurists like to talk about. We're going to talk about vertical AI because vertical AI is real, it's coming, and to some extent it's already here. And the manifestation of vertical AI that we're going to talk about, or we're going to start talking about, is going to be autonomous driving. Because this is a section of artificial intelligence that everybody in this room will likely experience in some way or another. Whether it's a car that's driving itself, or maybe you get food that is delivered by a car that's driving itself, or a package delivery or something like that. Within most of our, I hope, lifetimes, we will experience this. And it has, for all of its benefits, a potential downside that you heard talked about at various other panels before. In our country, America particularly, we're very vulnerable to the effects of this kind of AI. 35 out of 50 US states cite truck driver as their #1 occupation. And furthermore, about 3.5% of the US cites driver as a full-time job. 3.5% of the population. So if all those jobs went away, it would tank the US economy, right? And the knock-on effects for economies around the world are similarly important. So the question really is, do we think this is going to happen? And if so, how long is it going to take? And for this one, we're going to turn first to Jonathan, just because this is something that your company talks about and deals with a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a really important distinction to make here, again, just like you made between vertical and general AI with regards to autonomous driving. There's the problem of autonomous driving in urban environment, which is what the Ubers of the world are trying to solve. And there is a problem of driving on highway. It turns out that driving on highway is much, much simpler than driving inside a city. And so when you think of the two main streams for autonomous vehicles, then all of a sudden you realize that the onset of the trucking, the autonomous trucking, could actually come much faster than the robo-taxi that everyone is talking about. And so, as Joe mentioned, the trucking industry is a huge industry, and it is one of the largest employers in the world, and in the US particularly. And so, when will it actually start, and what are the key attributes, or what are the key knobs that determine this onset? So, the first one is the financial interest, right? How big is the financial interest for the parties involved, the incentives to actually make it work? And Morgan Stanley, in a study recently, identified that there's about $168 billion that will be saved through the deployment of this technology. This is a lot of money. So there is pretty high stakes at the game. The second question is how complex it is technologically to actually solve the problem. And as I hinted in the beginning, if you can differentiate between driving on a highway and driving in the city, you simplify the problem quite a bit. One of our first customers, a company named Otto that was recently acquired by Uber, has a really interesting approach to this. What they're saying is that instead of building big trucks that will drive all the way from one warehouse to the destination, you can use autonomy for the highway portion of the trip and then use human driver for the last few miles that actually take the truck to make the last delivery. And that's a very clever approach, but of course when you do that, you're going to need fewer drivers because most of the hours and most of the miles clocked by these autonomous trucks happen on the highway. And so that too hints for faster or more rapid onset. The third parameter is the human parameter. If you think of the robo-taxi and the challenges that that technology is facing, one of the key elements is popular resistance by taxi drivers or the political constituencies that they create to protect their unions. It turns out that the trucking industry, interestingly, in the US is not unionized. And so there are fewer organizations that actually push against this type of innovation. And so yet again, another reason for this change to appear earlier. And so when you combine all of these together, you get a picture that says that in the trucking space, the trucking arena, this change could come even faster than in the robo-taxi. And the last piece that probably is important to consider is how expensive and how long would it take to build autonomous trucks, right? Yesterday, Elon Musk mentioned that if there's 200 million cars built every year, and how many billions of...
I think there are 2 billion, he said 2 billion
sorry,
cars
100 million,
and 100 million.
100 million and 2 billion. So it takes about 20
capacity,
years
yeah.
to sell into the existing market for cars. Well, in the trucking space, you don't need to replace the car. You simply retrofit it with a set of sensors. And so there's a way to leapfrog even that challenge.
So how long is the question?
Combining all of this together, I believe that you're going to see commercial use of the technology sometime in the next 2 years, and you're going to see very rapid market adoption from the big delivery corporations. You know, this could be the Walmarts, the Amazons, and so on of the world, which will probably take 5 years or so. And so in 7 years, you're going to see massive volume of miles that were driven by humans shift to trucks.
So already you're seeing a pretty substantial workforce change in 5 to 7 years.
I do.
You agree?
Well, I think it's a good example for a couple of reasons. It shows that this is real, right? We had our first auto delivery in the fall, right? So this has happened, and it's going to continue to happen pretty quickly. But it also shows how complicated this situation is. You can throw out stats that show how many jobs this is going to replace, how many states cite truck driving as their number one means of employment. But the U.S. Trucking Association will also tell you that the average age of the trucker is on the rise, that the number of truckers needed at this point is on the decline, and they don't have enough truckers to satisfy the needs of so many operations. This technology can fill that need, right? I think it's dangerous when you think about this as an either or.
Yeah.
In many cases, and this is true not just in the trucking industry, not just in the self-driving car industry, these technologies can complement what humans do, right? They can complement what's going on now. They can complement what goes on in the future. It's not necessarily, a replacement, so to speak.
But let me put the pointed question to you, which is, Cade, do you think that autonomous driving will take human jobs in the next 5 to 7 years?
I think it's difficult to say how quickly that's going to happen. A lot of people, as Jonathan says, driving a truck across a highway is a different problem than driving a car in an urban area.
Cade, you're a fantastic journalist, but you should be in government.
Maybe so, but there are AI researchers working in this area, working on self-driving cars in particular, who will tell you that all it takes is one extremely serious accident to set the whole movement back for years.
Right.
Right. There are people in the industry who really believe that.
But preparing for automation to take human jobs is not something that you start doing a year before it happens.
No, you start doing it now.
Right. And so with that in mind, let's introduce let's not just brush over the topic that so many people here have just thrown out as an eventuality. Let's talk about universal basic income. And for those of you who don't know, universal basic income, or UBI as we're going to call it, is we've been talking about it a lot recently, but it's not a new idea. It dates back to the 16th century. A writer named Thomas More, who suggested a basic universal income as a means of curtailing crime, because if people didn't have to steal to eat, they wouldn't steal to eat. You've seen it when it manifested in the 70s in the Alaska Permanent Fund, where residents of Alaska who live for a certain amount of time in that U.S. state receive a dividend. And then also in Brazil, there is the Bolsa Familia program, where they're testing out giving citizens a basic amount of money to live with. And then also, we're really lucky to have Elizabeth Rhodes with us over Skype, because Elizabeth is working on a pilot program for universal basic income in Oakland, California. Elizabeth, can you talk about these programs a little bit and tell us sort of how they've worked historically and what people are learning from that?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, the idea is not new, and there have been a number of different permutations of this implemented. So the Bolsa Familia is a conditional cash transfer program designed to encourage people to pursue education and improve health. There are a number of these basic, sort of more conditional programs that are being implemented all over the developing world, and research has shown very positive outcomes related to improvements in income and livelihood and health and education. In terms of now sort of shifting that conversation to more of a broad discussion on more unconditional, providing a basic income to individuals regardless of whether or not they work, and how that would play out on, say, a national level. And what's interesting is we are beginning to study this, and we're planning for a fairly large-scale, longer-term experiment where we will provide individuals with a basic income. But one of the things that we're really thinking about is that the traditional metric by which we generally evaluate whether it's any sort of social assistance or social welfare programs currently is how it affects labor supply. The idea that if you just give people money, they will quit working, and that's going to affect the productivity of the economy and sort of lead to worse economic outcomes for the society as a whole. Whereas in this sort of future where AI is involved in so much increased productivity with fewer labor hours, the conditions are different. As labor disintermediated from productivity, then how people spend their time is, less tied to, perhaps for some people, less tied to employment. And so as we are, certainly Y Combinator is starting to pilot this, Finland, Canada, there's a lot of different studies being started now trying to look at what are the effects both on an individual level, in communities, and even to larger sort of macroeconomic phenomenon.
So people are getting behind this in a pretty substantial way, but it's not unanimous that UBI is something that is a road that should necessarily go down. Cade, you've talked a lot about how there's a strong opposition to UBI.
Right. I think it's worth saying, again, I'm playing the politician here, I suppose, but it's worth saying that Elizabeth is testing this out, right?
Yeah.
And it's worth testing this out. But in order to really implement this, you need a tremendous amount of money. The economy has to be able to support it. The progress in AI and automation has to be at the level where you can fund this, and it's not clear that's going to happen. Many economists question whether or not, in the long run, this will actually hurt the economy, and it will not encourage people to feed the economy in the way we need to feed them.
What are the reasons they're citing?
Well, John and I were talking about, before the panel. If you're given a UBI, to simplify it, you have two options. You can play video games, or you can sit around and say, well, how can I feed the economy? What is my next project? In one sense, you could argue it gives you the time that you need to plan your next move. In another respect, it gives you time to do nothing. Which way will people go is an open question. And so many economists believe it's the wrong thing to do because it will slow down the economy.
So what would they suggest in its place?
Well, there are many options, but the primary message, and this was the message of the Obama administration in December. A month before Obama left office, his Council on Economic Affairs released a report on AI and the economy, and their recommendation was not to implement a UBI, but to instead focus on education and job training. Right? Ultimately, the way you feed that economy is you educate your workers in new ways of making money for themselves, in new jobs.
So education is a really important aspect of this, and nobody's going to argue that education isn't something that government should focus on, right? But the problem with education is that it's incredibly politically vulnerable because it's an expensive program, and the effects of it aren't felt for decades, potentially. How do you get around that? And doesn't that make UBI sort of tempting because it's a program you could potentially enact in tandem with education?
You could, and I mean, I think it's worth exploring all these things. I mean, just because education is not politically the best option doesn't mean you should ignore it. And that's part of the tension we have now in the U.S. is that, you know, the government's policies aren't necessarily in line with what's happening, right? And you've got to try to align those in some way.
I'd like to think of this in a slightly different way. I don't know whether UBI is the right solution or not, but as government officials around the world and here are thinking about this, they need to realize that there's going to be a short-term challenge, there's going to be a long-term challenge.
Yeah.
If you think about the long-term challenge, then absolutely education can and will help, right? If people lose jobs, you need to train them and you need to help them build a prospect of economic freedom. But in the short term, when the velocity of adoption of potentially disruptive technologies, like the one we discussed with the trucking segment, for instance, there could be years, could be 5 years, could be 10 years, in which you don't see the fruits of your investment in education just yet, but political unrest can grow quite a bit. There is a very important economist, French economist named Piketty, who famously connected in a mathematical formula the likelihood for social unrest with the returns on capital versus the returns on labor. And historically, he has shown how the likelihood of a revolution or a war is statistically correlated with these two factors. And it happens to be the case that in the Western world, in the US in particular, inequality is on the rise, and some would argue Trump's election is an indication of some of this social unrest that is rising. And so there is a real concern or a real blind spot that regulators should address in the next 4 to 8 years so that we can smooth sail this transition until education and its fruits actually outweigh the challenges that autonomous vehicles and robotics introduce.
So building on that, I have a question for Elizabeth, which is, does a UBI actually address the problem of income inequality? Because isn't it something that's stigmatized to the point where you could actually, it might actually in some ways, if you're taking advantage of UBI, be seen as a, I mean, couldn't that have a negative impact on your social standing?
Well, I think part of the advantages cited for UBI is that it is universal. It's framed as, you know, a citizen's dividend in some places. It is, you know, it's individuals' right. And so as opposed to some other sort of means-tested and targeted forms of assistance, it should have less stigma. And sort of building on the discussion about education, what currently there's certain, you know, segments of the population that are better positioned to capitalize on educational opportunities and, you know, the new jobs available as technology changes. there are, real costs to furthering your education as well as opportunity costs in terms of lost wages. And so a basic income, or UBI, also provides that income security and that safety net that allows people to take risks and use other forms, whether it's education or other avenues to prepare for jobs in a changing economy. That currently, if you're trying to work multiple jobs to make ends meet, you're not able to make those changes.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so we had all sort of agreed before this was over that, taking into account the audience that we were speaking with, a lot of governmental people, each of our panelists was going to give a piece of sort of context, or if you want to call it advice, about things to think about going forward with UBI and AI. And after that, we'll take a couple of questions. So do you want to start, Cade?
Sure. There are a couple things I think about here. One is that as many people will tell you that they are sure they know what's going to happen with this, the reality is we don't know. There's no precedent for this. We've had precedent for immense technological change, but this is different. And it's unclear how it's going to play out, how many jobs it's going to create versus how many jobs it's going to eliminate. And so I think it is very much a balancing act. I think that one thing that people can agree on in the AI field, and people who know this, is that one thing we don't want to do is try to regulate AI in any one particular sphere. Like, part of the worry in the US is that AI, because of these fears, will be regulated, and the result of that is that it just continues to progress in other parts of the world. The production you talked about continues to go up in other parts of the world, and it goes down in the US, or whoever else tries to regulate it. That's a real worry at this point to a lot of people in the industry, at least in America.
I think Cade is spot on. You could call it technological protectionism, and that's the thing you want to avoid. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the current administration has demonstrated that they are quite protectionist when it comes to global trade, immigration, etc. And we certainly hope that they wouldn't phase that approach also to AI. One thing that I would add for policymakers is, we talk about hard facts, we talk about numbers, we talk about dollars, but we need to have empathy, right? These are real people that we talk about. These are children, families, and you need to give people a sense that they can control their destiny, and you need to give people hope. And in order to provide stabilization, which is in everyone's interest for the economy, you need to give people this inspiration. And so education, in my opinion, is something that every government around the world should invest in as a long-term remedy for the concerns around AI.
Thanks. And Elizabeth, you're up.
I think my advice is be proactive. It's gonna take years, as these problems develop, to provide to generate the data necessary to inform policy choices. So I think we need to think about what challenges could have come up, what are potential solutions, and then really what are the key questions that we want to learn about those solutions, and develop well-designed research studies that will get at those questions so that we, as things change, we're better prepared to respond in ways that are most effective.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth.